Kerry at NAFI. We're all based at Charles Darwin University, which you've probably visited. We're involved in the Savannah Fire Forum very heavily. We started the Savannah Fire Forum a number of years ago. I've been working for Jeremy since 1996 or 7 or something. So nearly 30 years. And in that time, he employed me basically to start working on a project in West Arnhem Land. And I'll show you the reasons why that project commenced at the time. But I thought I'd give you a bit of a background into bushfires in North Australia, why we've got these carbon projects, where it all came from. It just sort of grew, you know. We didn't sort of have a plan 30 years ago to make this happen today. This is things that grew from opportunities and conversations and collaborations, mostly collaborations, I'd have to say. So that's the message I could give you all today. It might not be clear in everything that I'm showing, but everything that I'm showing here today has been the work of a large group of people. So many traditional owners from mostly Arnhem Land, but Kakadu, excuse me, and lots of scientists from other organisations, the CSIRO in Australia, we've got a colleague in Portugal, we've got colleagues in the US, we've got colleagues in France and Italy, and Africa now, lots and lots of colleagues in Africa, colleagues in South America. Indonesia, we've worked in Indonesia a lot with a lot of different people, and we've worked in PNG. So, you know, we're all about collaborating, working with people who basically, Jeremy's a botanist, a forester by trade, and he was very interested in fixing the problems that we could see were happening with fire management in all over the world, but you know, the environment was being neglected. The environment is always a very poor cousin to, you even look at the budget of any government, and the environmental budget is very, very small compared to any other component. There's a lot more money put into agriculture, and more money again put into mining, you know, all of these, aside from the essential services, the environment is very, very poor cousin, always. So that's the kind of thing we've dealt with. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Savannah and the fires and the history of that and how it's changed, and that'll give you some idea of where we were and why we had to do what we're doing. I'll demonstrate that with some of the impacts of the poor fire management that we used to have, that we were first experiencing 30 years ago. Then I'll talk more specifically about this West Arnhem Land Fire Abatement Project, which is the first project that started about 25 years ago. And then you've heard a lot about the Savannah Burning Program, so I'm just going to skip over that, and I might show you some of the GIS if you're interested, and then some of the latest research that's all grown out of this. So this is a map of Australia, pretty big area. What is about 7.7 million square kilometres, reasonably big continent. That area to the north is the tropical savannas. That's about 25% of the continent. All that darker orange area we call the rangelands. They're a mixture of grasslands dominated by one grass, Triodia, a number of species, a genus with a number of species, but very widespread across the rangelands. Extremely flammable grass, not like your normal tussock grasses. It's a hummock grass. It starts small and spiky and grows in big rings. So it can take some years, depending on rainfall, for it to connect. So we can have a very long period without fire, but then if we get enough rainfall, that grass will grow and quite considerably and cause fires that are unstoppable, that will sweep across thousands and thousands of square kilometres. Similar problems in Africa that we've noted. Those areas in green on the map, the southeast and the southwest, are the temperate woodlands and forests. That's sort of the typical, you know, nice looking country that you see in all the brochures and the videos and the maps of it. And that's also where probably 95% of the population live too, if not more. So now back up to the tropical savannas in the north. This is the rainfall for Darwin on average. over a 30-year period. And you can see I've got it spread out from May to April to split the year in two. We're in the middle of the wet season, so that period in the second half of the year where we've got a very abundant rainfall. And that's pretty characteristic of the whole of North Australia. It's a little bit variable, a bit less. Darwin's in probably one of the highest points. I think we receive about 1,500 millimetres of rain annually, or seasonally, I should say, in that rainfall period. And you can see the dry season's got very little rain. So they're the standard designations: the dry season, the wet season, and then you've got these traditional seasonal breakdowns with a lot more detail about what's happening with the weather patterns generally, rather than just wet and dry. So you can see there's a lot more detail in the traditional knowledge of even just the climate. That dry period, the dry season, when it starts in May, you can see we have very little rainfall, and then it drops off, and so you can imagine the landscape without rain but very high temperatures up here dries out very quickly and becomes very flammable. So fire management has to rely on that fact, and with climate change we're finding that window is changing and becoming smaller. That boundary between the early and late dry season is kind of important. It's a time when the relative humidity changes quite quickly. It's usually over a period of a week or two, and then that makes the flammability much higher. It means the grasses will burn during the night. There will be no dew. The grasses won't get wet at night like they can commonly do in the early dry season, and that increases the flammability and increases the intensity of the fires quite considerably. So this is all very important in terms of how we manage fire and how fires affect the landscape. So you can call we generally think of the late dry season as having a larger proportion of hot fires, of these late dry season intense fires, and the early dry season as the period where we undertake prescribed burning, because we can burn knowing that the fire will probably go out at night. You can jump in and ask any questions along the way, I don't mind. This is just a bit of a Q&A, so if you do have a question, please just pop your hand up. I don't mind at all. So when we started out looking at bushfires in North Australia, this report came out from the Australian government called the State of the Environment Report, 1996. That's about when I started working for Jeremy. And this map illustrated the state of knowledge of the distribution of fires in Australia. And you can see that the southeast and the southwest, where all the people are, where all the ecologists and scientists and land managers are, that's where they thought all the fires were happening, because that was their experience. As far as they were concerned, the rest of the country didn't have any fires. They didn't know of anything, because nobody was reporting on it. There was no data. There was actually no data to report on. So then we started mapping, or different agencies, when I say we, it's lots of people. You want to go back?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes, thanks so much.
So that report, I think I've got the, State of the Environment 1996. You can look that up on the internet, the report's available. They produce a new one every about 3 years, I think, of these reports. And they're quite detailed. There's usually a very small chapter on fire in there, but there's, you know, it's quite significant. So this is now satellite mapping. We started mapping, we had colleagues in Alice Springs who actually started this off, a friend and colleague of mine, Grant Allen. He lives in Alice Springs, which is right in, can I move the mouse? No. Oh yeah. Alice Springs is about here, right in the middle of the country. It's in the Northern Territory. And he started this by mapping from satellite. He was from Canada and they'd been using it over there, and he brought that knowledge over here and started doing this mapping. It's a very broad scale, 1 kilometre pixels at best. But then that was picked up by an agency over here that's Western Australia, this state over here, and the city of Perth is down here in the southwest, and because they're isolated, they're a bit innovative. It's one of the most isolated capital cities on the planet. Apparently, to the west, to the east, is the nearest city is Adelaide, which is 3,000 kilometres, and to the west, I think you've got Madagascar. So it's that kind of remoteness that Perth was dealing with. And they were like, oh, we'd love to do that. We'd like to know more about Western Australia. As you saw, there was no information, if we go back to this map, no information in Western Australia. They had this huge landscape to manage and no knowledge of what was going on. We'll adopt this, they said. And so off they went, and they're the ones who produced this mapping. It's actually the mapping that until recently has been going into the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory with the International Panel on Climate Change. So it's a very significant data set. And as I said, they started that in the mid-90s, and I have been doing it ever since with various data. But look at the difference here now. This is fire frequency, and you've probably seen these fire frequency maps. You know what they are. The red shows areas that have burnt nearly every year, all the way back down to green, where there's only been one fire in that period, which was, which year is it? 1997 to 2017. So that's 20 years, 20-year fire frequency distribution map. So you can see there are some big and significant fires down there in those forests in the southeast, and they do kill people, and that's why they get so much attention. There's a lot of people living there. There's a lot of problems with that. But you can see across North Australia, that band across the north, there's a very high frequency of fire because we have these flammable grasses, we have this climate that is conducive to annual fires occurring, and so if we don't do something, it will burn. So that's why the prescribed burning program and the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is possible and important to do. You'll also note on this map of Australia, so you can see the dark lines are the state boundaries. There and there. This is the area that NAFI maps, the grey area. And then these two lines, this dashed line up here is a 1,000 millimetre rainfall ISO height. So above there, the rainfall is above 1,000 millimetres. And ecologically, that's also very significant because everything behaves quite similarly. 1,000 millimetres seems to be the amount of rain that's required to produce a maximum, an optimal amount of fuel, grass fuel, tree growth, etc. So everything behaves very similarly there and will grow to its optimal state, and fuels are optimal there. In this 600 to 1,000 millimetres, it's a bit less. And what's interesting, and I'm not sure if I've got them back here, is that the rainfall gradient for Australia, particularly in the north, goes from very high up here to very low in the centre of the continent. So you've got this interesting transept of rainfall, almost a straight line. Another fire frequency map for 2004. So this is when projects got going. So again, just showing the distribution. So this area, that tropical savanna area, I showed you in that earlier map. This is it, the 25% top of the continent. You can see in that period, there's a bit of prescribed burning going on. So this is that early dry season fire that we are doing. All of that is scattered, very small. But all that red stuff is wildfires. So a lot of it is lightning driven, but also human beings starting fires. And it's causing those sorts of problems because we weren't proactive enough. Yeah.
Just the previous slide.
What?
The previous slide. Previous slide on the general fire outline. The previous slide.
Previous, sorry. That one?
Yes. Which one is Eastern Australia?
The east to the right.
The right.
See, there's a north arrow. That's east.
No, I was trying to read somewhere to say Eastern Australia is the most prone fire area.
No, that's not true.
The map is.
No, that's not true.
Yeah. So which one is the most prone fire area?
The tropical savannas. Yeah. See how there's a lot of fire in the north?
Yeah.
Because it's fire prone. Yep. Okay. Moving on. So 2004 as an example. Yes, sorry. Did you have a question?
No.
Oh, you're just pointing.
That's in north.
Yes, north is up. 2004, and then again more fire frequencies, just showing the detail in the tropical savannas again. So the top map is fire frequency generally, so that could be early or late, any time of year. And this just shows the wildfires. So you can see with this map, with this kind of detail, we're providing people information about where they've got problems. So the higher the frequency, like here on the western side of Cape York, you've got this high frequency of late dry season fire. So that's a big problem, and as Sophia demonstrated in her modelling, the frequency of late dry season fires is completely bad and, you know, very deleterious to any habitat. That's what we know. Fire management, I've talked about it a little bit. Not all fires are the same. You know, a lot of people just think all fires are bad. You know, we shouldn't have any kind of fire, and that'd be great if we weren't in a very flammable landscape and we, you know, it just didn't burn. So I'll start by looking at giving you some examples of wildfires. So what do they do? Often we have total canopy scorch. That means the leaves on the trees are completely affected by the heat of the fire and go brown or are burnt off. A lot of the shrubs and small trees are completely killed by these wildfires, which means for species, so with plant species you can be a resprouter, so a lot of trees resprout after they're burnt or they're cut, but some species do not come back at all. They only will come back from seed, and they're called obligate seeders, and I'll be referring to them and showing you some examples of them in a minute. But basically the obligate seeders, if you have a fire and some seed is on the ground, the seed comes back, and before those plants can produce more seed, they are burnt again and killed, then that plant becomes extinct in that area. So if you've got large areas where that's happening and fires are too frequent, and that's why that 2 hot fires in 5 years model is very important for just about every habitat, is because of that effect on obligate cedar species. And also, what it also does affect is the home range of small animals. If an animal that only lives in the space of 1 kilometre has all of their resources burnt, then, you know, they'll become extinct as well. Here's some example. This is Triodia. I was talking about the grass. It's very widespread in Australia, covers most of the continent somewhere or other. Very, very common and dominant in the rangelands, but also very common and dominant in the tropical savannas. This is a rocky sandstone area, very typical of Kakadu and West Arnhem Land. And you can see the smoke coming off this Spinifex fire. We did some testing with people from the Japanese Space Agency who had a plane that flew basically a transect from Japan down to Northern Australia, looking at the various fires and the emissions, and it was found that the emissions from the smoke of these fires is like 100 times the World Health Organisation's level for human safety. So they're actually quite toxic and extremely widespread in Australia. So that's another story, and I can talk to you about smoke a bit later. Here's what it looks like after the fire. You can see that the trees have all been, and this is very typical, and I'll show you the extent of this in a bit, but you can see all of the ground layer has been consumed. There's only bare sand and dirt here. The leaves of all of the trees have been scorched, affected by the trees. All those leaves will fall off. In the case of the eucalypts, they will epicomically bud and produce new foliage, but they'll only do that so many times before they run out of energy. Can't do it again. This is a more extreme effect, you can see, which is known as total canopy consumption. You can see that the leaves of every tree has not only been scorched but consumed by the fire. It was that hot. And I mean, these trees are quite sparse compared to a forest. This is a woodland, and yet, you know, we don't have this canopy carrying fire, but still, there's enough heat in these fires that they all get consumed like that. And the amount of stem tree death is between 25 and 45%. On the other hand, we've got prescribed burning. The intention is that the intensity of the fire will be very low. The severity, how severely it affects the plants is low. They'll be patchy in the landscape as well. So you'll have patches of unburnt area, which is resource for the animals that live there, and also a seed bank for those plants that are not affected. It almost rarely affects the overstory of the trees, and therefore tree mortality after those fires is very low. Typically, we do a lot of this work in North Australia by a helicopter. This is a bit of a setup, but it illustrates how it works. So in the helicopter, we have a machine that drops incendiaries. You might have seen the rain dance machines at the fire forum. Hang on, something happened. Something said this not ejected properly. Check Sophia. She did get ejected. I can't do. Max. It's a Mac. I've been Mac attacked. Something, Sophia's thing which we pulled, we didn't eject. I just want to get running. Does it need to be collected? That thing can we get rid of that? Where are you from? No. Cool. So what happens is the helicopter has these little incendiaries. It's a little piece of plastic with wings on it, and it has potassium permanganate in it, and it puts glycol in, which creates an exothermic reaction, slow exothermic reaction. The little plastic thing falls down, hits the ground, and then starts burning, like a match, but a little bit slower, a little bit more intense than a match. Hits the ground and starts to burn. So you drop them out of the back of the helicopter as you're going along, and they start burning, creating these circles which eventually join up and can create a continuous line, which is a fire break. So this is what it really looks like. In the landscape, you can see the little puffs of smoke. We've come from here, dropping these little incendiaries, and they'll join up slowly and create a nice break, a fire break. If you do it on a not too windy day, nice and late in the day, then they'll go out pretty soon. But potentially they probably won't join up the first time, so you'll probably have to go back a week later and do it again and go over that same line, and get the bits that you didn't get last time and so on. You might have to go back 3, 4, 5, 6 times to make that break complete. And so that's what they do across the landscape. Over, I think, well, just for Arnhem Land, they talk about doing something like 40,000 kilometres of transect a year. So it's a very significant helicopter budget that everybody has.
Andrew, how do you take into account wind? Is the idea to get a cool burn spreading over a large area as quickly as possible, or more slower burn, more intense?
Not more intense.
Yeah.
A little bit of both, something in between. You know, you want a little bit of wind so it carries.
Yeah.
Because as you know, if it sits still for too long, it affects the plants locally. You're going to want it to move, because it's mostly only moving in the grass.
Yeah.
The leaf litter will go out quite quickly, because it's, you know, there's still a bit of soil moisture if you're doing it right. Yeah, I mean, it's very much, you have to know your landscape and have a play, and you might go out and drop a few incendiaries and go, well, not today. Today's not a good day. It's too windy or something. I'll do it tomorrow when the wind's down. So they're watching the weather all the time, you know, looking out the window, looking to see when to go.
Is it a similar kind of thinking to how the indigenous people did? You know, when they
That-
did the early burning, similar.
Of course, a lot of these projects are run by Indigenous people.
Yes.
A lot of the knowledge we have about burning is like why we burn and where we burn and when we burn comes from a lot of traditional knowledge about managing these habitats. Because I mean, Aboriginal land management shaped the modern ecology, so that we want to copy it. I mean, even people say, oh, before Aboriginal people, there were big fires, burned everything. And it's like, yeah, but then we've had tens of thousands of years of human land management that we kind of need to perpetuate if we want to keep the biodiversity that we have. So
I mean, we're trying to do the same thing in Botswana. Just trying to understand exactly how the San people use fire.
Yeah.
The conditions that we really need to get down to the bottom of, the hows and the whys and the wheres and all of that.
Wheres and whens and
Yeah.
why. Yeah. I mean, you can start out with some very specific things we did. We have a pine, an endemic cypress pine in North Australia. I'll show you some pictures later and tell you what. And so we focused on that because it's a very long-lived obligate cedar plant, so it only comes back from seed. It takes nearly 10 years to produce seed from growth. It's nearly 10 years before it'll produce its first seed, so it's quite a good indicator and there was lots of it in the landscape. So it means that Aboriginal people were burning in such a way that those trees were not being killed.
Yes.
They were, so that's a pretty easy one for us to know, and it's very easy to see in the landscape. If you're flying around in a helicopter, you can go, oh, there's one. And even when they stand, even when they die, for quite a few years. Most things up here, we have a lot of big termite problem, we have a lot of termites. Most of those trees you'll see in the woodland out here, some ridiculous number, like 70% are hollow from termites. Not the cypress pine, they don't get affected by termites. So they will stay standing dead for a long time. So you can see how your fire regime is by how many dead to living cypress pine you have standing there. So that's been a very clear indicator to us about how our fire management is. And other obligate cedar plants like that are also harder to see, but also...
And Aboriginal people, they would typically also do a linear pattern, linear burns along...
Well, they would, because they were probably... I mean, we have a book, and I'll refer to it later, that you can see, with a chapter in it that was written by some people from West Arnhem Land, traditional Aboriginal people. And they basically talk about, we can imagine they were probably hanging around rivers and creeks most of the time to get water, and that's where the most of the food is. And as they're travelling, usually the men walked ahead burning, and so the women could see where the men were because they were burning as they were travelling to clear the way for the women and children, and the women were gathering resources along the way, yams and berries and so forth. And the men might have been hunting with those fires. So you end up with a network, a spaghetti kind of setup of fire breaks through the landscape as they were moving, because they were moving all the time. Following resources that they had scattered across.
But it kind of makes sense that they would think of doing linear burns, because effectively they're trying to, reduce fuel loads over a larger area. So it makes sense to do a linear.
It could have been the case that they did have, but the indications, the fact that we had these cypress pine and other obligate cedars very widespread across many parts of the landscape is strongly suggestive of a regime with mostly low intensity fires. So they were doing a lot of burning early in the season rather than later in the season, which cooks everything and kills lots of obligate cedars particularly. This is what they look like. So this is a eucalypt woodland. You can see the little triangle on the tree here. This is one of the many hundreds of plots we had in Arnhem Land that we all put in. We were measuring intensity there. So we measure all the vegetation there, how much biomass there is in the trees, in the grass and everything. You've probably heard about all that stuff. And this was a typical fire that we set late in the afternoon, which is the best time to do your prescribed burning, because then you know it's going to go out. And you can see it just trickling and burning the grass. Most of the litter's not even affected, And that's why we get so much emissions reduction in this kind of burning.
So when you first introduced this, there must have been quite a lot of backlash. People that had preconceived ideas that all fires are bad, and
In Southern Australia, that is still the case.
yeah,
Because of smoke and because of other industries. For instance, I had a friend who had a vineyard, a grape farm in Victoria, and they were proposing to do a whole lot of prescribed burning in the area where she lived, which was very new and unusual. And they did this burning about this time in February, sort of summertime down there. And the smoke went across her vineyard, and all the grapes tasted like smoke. So totally ruined them. So you've got these other effects down there that are much different. We don't have vineyards up here, so we don't have to worry about that effect. But no, up here, I think the biggest problem was a lack of people and money and therefore resources. And that's what carbon's done, has created an income for people to go and do this fire. Aboriginal people wanted to do this, they just weren't out in the landscape and weren't resourced to be out in the landscape anymore. You know, they were taken off the land or enticed off the land for various reasons.
yeah, because we've got quite a major challenge, between ourselves and the forestry department in just educating people and getting them to understand, that not all fires are bad.
Yeah, it's very hard.
It's quite a challenging.
It is challenging.
Thing.
It's been around only for a few centuries. It's obviously come from Europe where fires were bad because they only happened during hot summer times. They didn't understand the more tropical nature of fires in savannas, which is totally different way of thinking and behaving. So you can see here, this is a pretty good example of post-burning. So you can see that the incendiaries have gone along there, and the fires affected all of the understory. None of the overstory has been affected. The canopy is completely intact. This is the kind of result that people are trying to get through prescribed burning. Bit of stuff on the ground. This is just a great photo. I don't know if it's very illustrative of what we do, but people can use that. He's got, I don't know if they're familiar with a tool called a firebug. It's like a little can of mixture of diesel and petrol, and it's got a long rod with a bit of ceramic on the end that stays burning, and you can just run it along the ground, and it's called a drip torch firebug. This young man was using that on the back of a quad bike. And here's some young men doing some experimental burns. We had a whole lot of plots way up in the sandstone. This is absolutely magical country. So beautiful, all these beautiful obligate cedar plants and rare plants. It's so beautiful.
Was he driving with a fire behind him?
Pardon?
Was he driving with a fire behind him?
The last one?
No.
Yeah. Someone just took a photo. He was burned.
No, where is the one doing the fire? Is he the one driving and the fire behind him?
He was, yeah.
Was that not dangerous? Because he's driving and
A little bit.
he's moving on fuel and he's
Well, he stopped burning back
pulling
there.
fuel with him.
He stopped burning back there.
Oh no, I thought this is a... He drank a drink from him. Or is that a fire?
But way back there. He's not burning anymore.
Ah,
He's coming towards the cameraman.
I thought he was carrying a drink on his back.
Yeah. Anyway, so this is this experimental burn. So there's a lot of knowledge shared to do all of this burning. And then we did, with the fire plots, to gather all the information for the carbon methods, we had these, here's another triangle on a tree, transects, you can see we've marked all the trees, measured all the fuel, measured all the grass and everything. Did they go through all of that with you, Cameron and Jeremy? How it's all done? Yeah, cool. And then we measured it after the fire. So there's a typical prescribed burn gone through. You can see even the shrubs here are not affected by that fire. That's how low the intensity is. So it's pretty good stuff. Very different to those earlier hot fires that we saw.
We saw many shows about areas, fires, but I didn't see nothing about wildfires this side, that you manage the fires for.
What did you say? Log fires?
I didn't see anything about the animals inside that you are managing the fire.
Oh, I'll show you in a minute. I'll show you some stuff about animals.
Okay.
I'll get there. Sorry. So we then, once we sort of started to gather this information, we're collecting data, we went to the people in West Arnhem Land and they were wanting to get back out into their country to manage it. So that's where this West Arnhem Land project started and all the carbon started. And it also started with a company called ConocoPhillips who put a gas plant in Darwin Harbour. Meanwhile, one of their contractors bulldozed a big rainforest patch. So they said, oh, well, we'll offset that because we've made a mistake. And they put some money into this as well. And they ended up putting about $17 million into it, strangely. So this is the area. It's out in the middle of the top end. But this is about 200 or 300 kilometres east of us here, out in Arnhem Land. So this is Kakadu National Park, this boundary here. This purple line is what's called the Arnhem Plateau. So this is a raised, very rocky, all that rocky landscape I've shown in some of the photos, that's all out here. Because it's so rocky and so rough, the terrain, there's a lot of what they call refugia, you know, places for animals and plants to hide from fire out there. So it's been, you know, it's very, very unique and has the highest number of rare and threatened plant species than anywhere else in Australia. So the green colouring is the fire mapping for that year in 2004. So you can see there's been a bit of effort put in. This is when the program started. Bit of effort up this road, some helicopter burns out here, a lot of burning out here in Kakadu. These lowlands out here are full of grass. They get burnt like this every year from all the prescribed burning. Looks big, but it's actually quite patchy. And Kakadu's always had a lot of money. Kakadu's had a lot of money since the 80s to manage an Australian government managed park, very wealthy compared to everybody else. But then this is what happened that year. It was a hot year, there'd been plenty of rain in the wet season, and you can see all of these yellow, orange and pink colours are the late dry season fires, the hot fires, and they're just burnt through this. So those pictures I showed you of those scorched trees and stuff, that comes from that area there, from that year. It was pretty bad and pretty typical. There were 5, so what we did was I made this map and I took it to a meeting. Nobody had ever sort of looked at this before, not in the way we knew we could. This was a great opportunity, good and bad opportunity. And I designated these 5 fires. I found where they came from. We kind of knew who had lit them. And we took this to a big meeting with all the Kakadu staff and all the new rangers for the West Arnhem Land area and a whole lot of traditional owners for the West Arnhem Land area. And nobody had ever seen fire maps before. Took it into the meeting and said, all right, here's the 5 fires. This is where they started. Looked around and at the people who knew they'd lit them and they were sort of hiding. But they stood up and they said, look, I did that. I didn't know this would be the effect. I'm sorry, won't happen again. And that changed everything. Everybody started to improve their fire management from that meeting onwards because of this one fire map. So I can definitely point to the power of the fire mapping and how it can, you know, inform people. Everybody, you can not be able to read, you can not speak the same language, but you can look at that map and you can know what's going on very easily. It's a gift all humans have, is to be able to look at maps.
Why do they burn every year in Kakadu?
Why? So that's the prescribed burning program. It looks bad, and it kind of is, but
Isn't it better to have rest periods, like unburnt years?
yeah, sure. And
In terms of
in
maintaining
lots of
the-
areas they do. So there's areas that are white, they're rested
Yeah.
for that year, and they might not be burnt. It still ends up being it's actually about 40%.
So it's still rotational.
It's rotational, probably every 3 years.
Right.
On average, it'd probably be 3 years.
And what is the optimal, in terms of optimal biodiversity, what's your ideal rest period in between burns?
The longer the better. But on average, we get about 3 years. Under a regime of a lot of intense work, you'll still only get about 3 years. The idea is to try and get chunks of it that are longer unburnt. And I'll show you an example shortly in West Arnhem Land where they're really achieving. And Sophia's threshold work and the work we've been doing with thresholds is quite illustrative of that now. And you can see the regimes have changed from. So this is 2022 mapping. If you remember that earlier, did I have it? So that was 2004, if you recall, before anything happened. Those big fires, with the 5 big fires, etc. This is what it looked like. That's all late dry season burning all through here. This is all early dry season. But you can see it's still quite blobby, patchy, because there wasn't enough money for people to go and do this. So rather than go in May and do a lot of little burning, they'd wait till July and do a lot of big burning, because then they could get more bang for their very little buck. You know? So the money has changed. The amount, having money to resource these programs has changed everything for fire. So sorry, go back to that 2022. This is what we're looking at now. All of that, look at this tiny little spaghetti network all through the landscape.
That's more how it should be, isn't it?
This is what we want. This is what we think is
Mosaic,
ideal.
patchwork mosaic.
Yep. I mean, there are still ecologists that think this is too much, but look at that as an example. There's hardly a wildfire, and when you do get a wildfire, lightning started or human started wildfire, they haven't got anywhere to go. They're contained in these little tiny microcatchments everywhere. And even if they do get going, well, you've got plenty of fire breaks to go out and do your suppression off so you can stop them. And we're also finding they're not very intense because they don't have enough time to build up into a big fire. They just sort of get going and then they're kind of out because they've got nothing to burn. The fuel's been... Because they might only be burning in 2-year-old fuel rather than 5 or 10-year-old fuel. So they just can't get the intensity they used to have. It's absolutely remarkable how it's changed everything. But it's money and people, isn't it? So a little bit about the flora and fauna. Somebody asked about fauna. So we have a lot of rodents and other creatures that live out in the landscape, and they all have quite small, surprisingly, home ranges. So this little guy, this rabbit-eared rat, used to be everywhere. They're only in small pockets now, and he has a home range of only 1, or she has a home range of 1 hectare. He probably got more. He's probably all over the place looking for lots of girls, but it's only a hectare. That's like 100 metres by 100 metres. It's nothing. That's where they live and they don't leave there. So if you burn all of that, it's got nothing to eat. It's got nowhere to hide. We've got a lot of cats in the landscape now. Cats have been introduced to Australia, however many decades ago, and they're just everywhere, smashing all this wildlife. But they do okay if they've got somewhere to hide and plenty to eat, if they're healthy and they've got good nesting resources. Here's another one, the native quoll. It's a cat, native cat. They're not doing very well. Their home range is a little bit bigger, 1 kilometre. But again, if you knock out that 1 kilometre like you can with those big wildfires I showed you, then they're gone. This is a really beautiful creature. You find them in the Darwin area quite a lot, black-footed tree rat, but they're not common elsewhere. Their home range, depending, I think the females have a smaller home range than the males, who roam a bit more, because the females nest, obviously, and they've got these very small home ranges. So big fires have affected them and, in a lot of cases, extinguished them from very large parts of the landscape. We've got a really big problem with species extinction in Australia. And then the plants, similarly. So this is, you can see this plant, it's hiding out here in this rocky area because it doesn't get, but the fire can't get to it. So it's persistent there, but it's not persistent in a lot of other areas where it was before. It's this beautiful myrtle, smells stunning, got these beautiful red flowers, but it will only, it needs about 6 years to grow, to mature, to set seed. And if it does get a little bit of scorching, it'll drop all those seeds immediately, and they'll go into the sand and, and grow during the next wet season. But if you get another fire into that within a couple of years, that's it. That plant's gone from that area. It's extinct, and that's what we're discovering. And then onto our cypress pine, which I was talking about before. You can see these dead ones here. They persist. They stand for many, many, many years, like decades. They'll stay there. So you can see how the demographics have changed, usually because of fire. It's usually fire that kills them. And they hide in these rocky areas, but they used to be everywhere. So we know fire regimes change for quite some time. Talking about the ecological benefits of more so for this area. So here we are back in the top end again, Darwin here. These three major national parks that we manage. Kakadu is 2 million hectares, and this is Arnhem Land. It's what's called an Aboriginal Land Trust.
So look at the main things that show us something about faunal inventory or faunal inventory. We have our conservation site in our country, and this puts a lot of money for our country. Tourists can there to visit and to see.
And sometimes it's like the foresters have to ask for permission to burn lands that are primarily wildlife conservation, and it hasn't really been smooth. So it's an issue that I'm not sure how in Mozambique, if you are the same agency that is managing both the wildlife and the forest, so much that then your plans can actually go in tandem. But for us, we have the wildlife department, who have the areas that they are not so interested in burning. So to burn those areas, it's like you have to talk to them, and they are the ones responsible for the fauna inventories. So and minding about the different habitats within the wildlife territories. So it's an issue that is quite difficult to discern, but I think it's something that needs to be talked about.
That we've talked to traditional owners about how to restore those habitats or how to manage those habitats with fire. So you may have heard Jeremy and Cameron talking the last few days about the Savannah Burning Program. And basically it was developed to, when we talked about improved fire management, we talked about doing prescribed burning and implementing a lot of prescribed burning. But there are habitats like grasslands, the floodplains, the jungles, etc., which are not conducive to burning early. They need to be burnt late or not at all. So those habitats are excluded from the Savannah Burning Project for that reason. So the habitats that I talk about putting prescribed burning into are only those habitats that were identified as being benefited by having prescribed burning. So fortunately or unfortunately, that's the majority of the landscape, because the majority of the landscape is eucalypt woodland or open forest or open woodland. So, you know, vast areas of this. I think Sophia showed a map earlier of the distribution of the different vegetation structural classes across North Australia. And you can see it's like 90% eucalypt woodland. So prescribed burning is appropriate for most of this. When we do the vegetation mapping, and I can show you some later in another talk, we map out those areas that are to be excluded, and then they're treated very differently, and then fire management is very different. So here, now what am I talking about? I was just going to show you some more various habitats. So just for some context, here we are in North Australia. There's Kakadu, Nipaluk National Park. That's about 3,000 square kilometres. Beautiful country. Litchfield, which is a bit of a basket case because it's got a lot of this African grass, Andropogon gaianus, gamba grass, we call it commonly. It's right through all of the Darwin area, and it's gone into Litchfield National Park, and it's a very big fuel. I think it's like about 30 tonnes per hectare is the biomass, compared to the native grasses are like 1, 2, 3 tonnes per hectare. So it's a ridiculous fuel, and when it burns all the trees, so we've got a very big problem. So Litchfield's another story. But as far as conservation land management, these areas here, that whole area there, is still very natural, but requires improved fire management. That's that Arnhem Plateau. It's a big sandstone outlier that sits in the middle of the top end. Very rugged country, and I'll show you some more pictures of that to illustrate how important it is. And all of the flora and fauna data, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, endemicism. It means it's a species that only occurs in that area. So plants that are native only to the Northern Territory, plants and animals. This is like a frequency distribution of where they all are. And you can see they're concentrated in this plateau area because there's all that refugia from fire. And that seems to be the main reason why they're there. This is what it looks like. This is an elevation model, which I've converted into slope. So you can see it's quite relatively flat here, but very topographically, compared to these lowlands out here, very topographically rough. And then I put some mapping over the top here. These orange bits are what we call, they're a sandstone shrubland. They have a bit of that spinifex grass in amongst them, but there are all these beautiful endemic obligate cedar species all through. You can see how extensive it is through there. And then the green bits are these rainforest patches that are quite extensive through there too. And again, they have a lot of endemics. There's a plant called Allosyncapia ternata. It's a big tree, a bit like a eucalypt, and it's distributed all through there in these big patches as well. Stunning. This is what it looks like, the edge of it. So this is the edge of the plateau. If I go back, probably somewhere about here on the edge of the plateau, looking back into Kakadu, and you can see the rainforest patches, this Allosyncapia ternata dotted. You can see how rough that landscape is up here and full of all these little shrubs. And then you've got the lowlands of Kakadu, which is all woodlands. You can see there's creeks running away with lots of paperbarks, Melaleuca species, but mostly very sort of undulating but quite flat and full of grasses that dry out very early and get burnt. There's lots of these beautiful perched wetlands. This is a lovely one up on Arnhem Land, but you can see here the damage. We've got Asian water buffalo rife through that whole country that come in. They're feral, and they smash up all these waterways because we've never had any big ungulates on the continent prior to their arrival. This would have just been some kangaroos and emus and small rats and other rodents living in this landscape. But the buffaloes are getting in there, and that water actually stank of buffalo urine. It looks pretty good, but it's in quite a bad state. There are other places that look much better where locally people are killing the buffalo. There's a typical river system up in there. There are these amazing river systems up through there, full of all these very different eucalypt species and other species, obligate cedar species. And lots of this is just a shot of one of the jungles, and you can see how dense they are and how many different species there are, and they're quite extensive through the area as well. This is typical eucalypt open forest. So this is a species known as Eucalyptus tetradonta, stringy bark. It's common right across North Australia. It grows in these beautiful open forest settings. Lots of shrubbery and other woody species. This wouldn't have been burnt for about 3 years. You can see all these acacia species coming up. They're quite fast growing. Fill the understory very quickly with lots of fuel. And yeah, so they're sort of the main habitats you find up there. And then again, this is this 2004 fire that took out all of that plateau that I was just talking about. So you can see what an incredible influence. That fire was fairly common, like it was about every 3 to 5 years you were getting this kind of thing happening for a few decades there. As opposed to 2010, this was the first really good year where they got some firing. You can still see there's wildfires around, but they're basically getting in and doing lots and lots of early dry season burning. Just quickly on greenhouse gas emissions, you know we've got all these plots. That's up there in that beautiful sandstone country. We burnt that little plot. You can see how much it's gone up as gases. We did lots and lots of ground assessments with lots of the indigenous rangers out there.
So how big are your plots?
Pardon?
What's the size of your plots?
What size?
What is the size of your plots? The one we just shot.
The size?
The size. Yeah.
Oh, 100 metres. Yeah, those 100 metre plots that Cameron probably would have talked about extensively. What do you call it? fuel measurement plot. Did you have a question? Oh yeah. Did you put your hand up? No?
No, Wednesday.
Cool. So you've probably seen this map quite a few times as well. So this is the extent of the carbon projects now. So you can see in that rather extensive area, we've got all of those areas are now have carbon money coming in because they're reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. We're able to calculate that for them. So just a few really important points about the savanna burning and its development. So the fire management itself, and I've said this a few times, but I'm going to say it again. It was developed in collaboration with a lot of traditional owners from right across North Australia, trying to help us collectively make a methodology that reflected proper ecological landscape management from a not only traditional owner perspective, but also using the knowledge of leading fire ecologists who were not Indigenous. And of course that uses the knowledges about where and when to burn to optimise that habitat. And that's what we spent a lot of time doing. And as I said, we've categorised areas for early dry season burning, and we exclude some areas from the emissions calculations, so we don't end up with anything perverse happening there. They can be managed in the way that people want to manage them. And as I said, they're the grasslands, the fire-intolerant communities like rainforest patches, etc. And as I said, all of that relies on annual consultation with traditional owners who review the information from last year before anybody does any burning this year. So there's a very big consultation process goes into the fire management planning every single year. So all of that burning that you see doesn't happen without the consultation and the support of the senior traditional owners, which is a very important part of all of those programs. And what this does, what the carbon money does, and I don't know if anybody's told you, is a lot of these people were relying on government handouts for any of the work that they were doing or just getting out onto their country. Now they've actually got their own income for the first time ever in their history of Australia's history. Aboriginal people have actually got their own income that they're getting from the work that they do. It doesn't happen pretty much in this extent in this landscape anywhere else. And a really important part of that is it means that people are out on their country with the stories and the knowledge that they still hold about the places in that countryside, which have very strong spiritual and cultural meaning to them, and also we're seeing very positive biodiversity outcomes. And aside from that, we're also developing a skilled workforce. People, they've got to have all this training. I mean, they're in and out of helicopters, they're using incendiary machines, they're using pumps, they're using communications, they're doing a lot of strategic planning, they're using mapping tools online and using a whole lot of different tools. You know, not everybody, but lots of people are. So we've got this upskilled workforce that are out there now that never existed before. And I'll show you something in a moment why that's important. But just a couple of resources. I don't know if you've seen, as Jeremy and Cameron pointed these books out to you before, they summarise, this first one not only summarises the methodology, but it summarises all the culture and the ecology of information we had at the time to put together an understanding of why we needed to do this. And this second book's really boring. I was an editor on it. It's just all the maths and everything, yeah.